Thanks, Mike, very much. Appreciate the kind words, and you have your priorities correct. Serving in Congress is an accomplishment versus having 7 good children. There's no doubt which is the biggest accomplishment. So you have your priorities correct, I think. I saw Mr. White, met Mr. White tonight. I was reminded of the first time I became actively involved in politics, and my wife and I were juniors in high school in a small town in Greene County here in Ohio, and 1964, and we got the idea that we wanted to support Mr. Goldwater, and so we designed our own campaign literature and passed it out. That is not too remarkable, except for the fact when I tell you what the small town was where we grew up, and that was Yellow Springs. Needless to say, our work did not result in a victory for Barry Goldwater in Yellow Springs, but we did have a lot of fun, learned a lot that year. The first time that I saw John Ashbrook, and I'm particularly honored to be here tonight because he was someone who I certainly greatly admired. I think anybody of my generation did. The first time I saw John was about that same time. Actually, I think it was 1963. And of all the places to see John Ashbrook for the first time, Antioch College seems a little strange. But John was on the campus of Antioch. There was a small group of good conservative Republicans, students. I say small, there weren't too many, but they were vocal and good. And they decided that what Antioch really needed was a little dash of reality, a little conservatism, and so they brought in John Ashbrook, and in fact, a few months after that, they brought in William F. Buckley and a few other good conservative speakers to shake up the Antioch community. So that was the first time that I saw John. My topic tonight is a tough topic, and I'm not going to pretend to have all the answers here tonight. Your previous speakers, I guess, have dealt with the issue of what's wrong with Congress. I don't know, though, if you really need any speakers to tell you that. All you have to do is turn on the evening news, or it was particularly evident last fall when the whole budget fiasco looked like the whole government was unraveling. You could see right there in living color every single night some of the problems connected with the United States Congress. So I'm not sure really what I can add to this, but let me just give you my perspective. As Mike indicated, retiring member of the United States Congress, maybe I'm a little more objective, although I think that if you'd asked me to give this speech a year ago, I think it would probably have been about the same. But as someone who's been there for 8 years, served in the minority, seen some of the things that you have seen, but maybe seen them up close a little more, let me just give you some of my perspective. Before I do that, and before I spend the time telling you about what is wrong with the United States Congress, I would like to make a couple comments. And I don't want to be accused of being an apologist for Congress, but I think a couple things have to be said before we spend the balance of our time bashing the Congress. Let's talk about a couple positive things. Number one, whether you will believe it or not, the vast majority of the members, the individual members of Congress, as people, as persons, are good people. They're exceedingly hardworking, and they're dedicated to their job. The vast majority of them I don't agree with on public policy, but as individuals, they're good people. There are a few people out there who are not, just as in any other group. Those are the ones you hear most about. Second, my father, every time he talks to me, I tell him what Congress is doing or not doing, and he's a businessman, and he just can't quite get it. He can't quite understand how any body of people could be so totally disorganized. He's used to running things and getting things done, and he just can't quite understand it. He's right, it is disorganized, but I would have one caution, and the caution is simply this, or the comment is simply this. No one ever said democracy was neat or tidy, and no one ever said democracy was very efficient. Now, if we want efficiency, we can have some other forms of government, but I don't know any democracy that is very efficient. And all the consternation, all the fighting that you see going back and forth, I think a lot of it is just basic to a democracy, basic to a republic like ours. Third thing, There is one thing that Congress does well, and I think they do it very, very well, and that is constituent service. And I'm going to talk about that in a moment, because constituent service is one of the reasons that we have such a high reelection rate, and it's probably part of the problem. But I would maintain that in a day and age where we have a tremendous federal bureaucracy that cannot really be fathomed by the average individual or by anybody, really, there has to be someone who can get the attention of the bureaucrats, someone who can get the attention of the bureaucracy, the permanent bureaucracy, the bureaucracy that stays there no matter who is president, Democrat or Republican. Someone's got to be there to kick them once in a while on behalf of the people of the country. Congress does that very well, and we do it very well, I think, on an individual case-by-case basis. Now, I'm sure there are cynics who would say what Congress really has done is created the bureaucracy, created the problem, so that they would have something to fix on an individual basis so that they could curry favor with their constituents. Now, I don't really believe that, because I think that gives Congress too much credit for thinking of that. But the bottom line is Congress works well in that area, and if Congress didn't do it, if the individual congressmen and women didn't do it, we would have to invent somebody to do it. There has to be someone who advocates for the individual on a case-by-case basis. Now, having said that, let's talk about the problems connected with the United States Congress. I am tempted, and I hope I'm not being too partisan for the Democrats who are in the crowd, but I'm tempted to say that the only thing the House of Representatives really needs is 51 more Republicans, 51 less Democrats, and 1 less socialist. We have a socialist now in Congress, in case no one caught it in the last election. The United States House of Representatives has been controlled by one party since I was in the first grade, since Dwight Eisenhower was in his first term, 1953 and 1954. In the last 60 years, the Republicans have controlled the House of Representatives 4 years, 4 out of 60. We're going to talk a little bit maybe about why that is true. The most important vote that occurs in Congress, the only vote that really counts, is the first one that takes place and will take place on January 3rd every odd-numbered year when the new Congress is sworn in. And when you're a member of Congress and you're sworn in, you take the oath, and the first vote is what? The first vote is to select the new Speaker of the House of Representatives. Every Democrat votes for the Democrat nominee. Every Republican votes for the Republican nominee. And since 1955, that Speaker has been a Democrat, which means that every committee chairman is a Democrat, which means that every subcommittee chairman, we now have 130 or 140 subcommittee chairmen. I have a joke that I used to tell people that if I didn't know who a Democrat was, and I would pass him in the hallway, but I recognized him at least as being a Democrat, I would just say, "Hello, Mr. Chairman." And he would answer, because they're all chairmen, and they've created enough subcommittees that they're all chairman of something. Tip O'Neill used to say that being Speaker means controlling the agenda and controlling the flow, and they have done that since January of 1955. It's an awesome power and awesome responsibility. Now, let me take my partisan hat off for a moment and talk good government. There is something fundamentally wrong when one party is in power for that many years. What happens is you have really developing an arrogance of power. People begin to assume, those who are in the majority party, that that's just the way God intended things to be. I mean, it's just supposed to be that way. They're supposed to be in power, and the other side's supposed to be in the minority, and that's just the way it is. And so if the minority gets anything, well, it's a gratuity. It's charity. It's like you throw a dog a bone or something. The only thing that keeps really the majority from trampling the minority in a legislative body is the fear that someday, maybe soon, maybe late, but someday the other side is going to be the majority and we're going to be the minority. Well, that deterrent doesn't have much effect in the United States Congress that has not seen And so it's seen one-party rule, at least in the House, since 1955. So there is an arrogance of power, which from a good government point of view, putting aside any partisanship, creates, I think, some very, very fundamental problems. What are some of the problems? Why has this occurred? I think one of the problems that we face is the ability of incumbents to be reelected. Right before this election, you remember you heard all the talk on the nightly news shows, and you didn't have to turn on the nightly news. You just talk to your neighbor and get the same opinion about how bad Congress was, how changes had to be made. How many people did you hear say, I'm voting against every single incumbent, I don't care who it is, we're going to throw them all out? Well, look how many they threw out. Of the incumbents who sought re-election to the United States Congress in 1990, 4% lost. 96% were elected. And that was down from 2 years before, when 98% of the incumbents who sought re-election were re-elected. The only ones who lose, with very, very few exceptions, have had a personal scandal or some public scandal. And so what we have is a Congress that perpetuates itself year after year after year. A more interesting statistic, though, is what the turnover is in the Congress. Because if you go back, and I did some checking on the statistics, if you go back, let's say, go back to 1790, the re-election rate of incumbents wasn't much different than it was this past year. 92% of the incumbents who sought re-election in 1790 were re-elected. But what was different, and what was different throughout most of the history of this country, was that many members did not seek re-election. The statistics, let me give you a couple. 1790, 92% of the incumbents who sought re-election won. But only of the whole Congress, 58% came back, which means a large number of them, almost half, decided not to seek re-election for some reason. 1860, eve of the Civil War, the year Abraham Lincoln was elected president. 73% of the incumbents who sought re-election won, but over half the Congress changed that year. When Lincoln was sworn in, the Congress he looked at, over half were new members to the Congress. Tremendous turnover throughout our history. Moving up to 1900, at that point about 25% in 1900 did not come back. That's what has changed. When I entered Congress in 1982, about 10%, or about 20% did not come back. But from then on, every election year after that, it's only been about 10% that didn't come back. So originally, you had a body that the Founding Fathers thought would really represent the people. There would be citizen legislators. They would have quick turnover, a lot of new people coming in all the time. That has been changed till today. We have really professional legislators, many of whom stay on and on and on. Why do incumbents get reelected? The old joke is, of course, that everyone loves their own congressman, but they don't like Congress. And I think there's some truth in that. Why are members of Congress almost invariably reelected? Well, when you're a member of Congress, you kind of like that, to be reelected and have the odds in your favor. But I'm not sure it is good government, and I'm not sure it's in the best interest of the country. I would maintain that the more competition you have, the more marginal seats that you have, the more competitive seats that you have, probably the better off that you're going to be. Why the incumbents reelected so much? I would maintain that one reason is because of political action committees. Now, I know I'm going to step on some toes tonight, but I'm going to tell it like I see it at least. I think political action committees perpetuate incumbents and keep the Congress from changing. If I had my way, we would totally do away with all political action committees in the country. I say that having accepted political action committee money in the past. I play by the rules, whatever the rules are. It's certainly legal. There's no problem connected with it. But I think as far as good government, we need to change that. Let me talk and give you some figures. 1988, $86 million was given by political action committees to incumbents. 86 million. 10 million was given to challengers. $15 million was given to incumbents who had no opposition. Now, where does that money come from? I've got a little list here. I think the list is going to surprise you, particularly for those of you who are more conservative. What we find is that political action committees, no matter what their ideological bent, with some exceptions, basically give money to incumbents. This list was compiled by one of my colleagues, Dick Schultz from Pennsylvania. Basically, he has listed the percentage of political action committee money that goes to Democrats and goes to Republicans from each political action committee, and he's got it in descending order. The first ones you would expect. Carpenters Union. They gave 97% of their PAC money to Democrats, and they gave 3% to Republicans. And we can go on and on. Some of these you would expect because of the ideological bent. But let me give you some that I think would surprise you. Chemical Bank of New York, 74% to Democrats of the political action committee money they gave. USX, 71% to Democrats. The faxes are wonderful, I'll tell you. Payne Weber, 68% to Democrats. Metropolitan Life, 68%. Chrysler Corporation, 68%. American Express, 66%. Occidental Petroleum, 66%. Chicago Board of Trade, 66%. Delta Airlines, those of you who fly Delta, 65% went to the Democrats. I could go on and on and on. The list goes on. Point is, they don't give for ideological reasons. They don't give because they want to change Congress. They don't give because they want one member to defeat another person. They give the money because they basically want the influence, and they're betting on the incumbent because it's a better bet. You do away with that, I think you begin at least to level the playing field. There are other reasons why incumbents win. The mailing privileges certainly are very, very important. The satellite hookups are very important. Local TV stations now have the ability to localize their national news like they've never done before. A local member of Congress can be live, as I have many, many times, on TV back in, from my district, Dayton, or back into Columbus, live on the 6 o'clock news, reporting directly live from Washington, D.C. with the Capitol in the background. It's good visual, it's good TV, it's good news, and it also happens to be good for the incumbent member of Congress. So there are a lot of reasons why incumbents have the ability to stay in office. And I think when we try to analyze some of the problems with Congress, we need to look at that. Let me move to another one. So what I have labeled the scorecard madness, or the rise of the special interest groups. Let me tell you a couple stories. Several years ago, I had a woman who came into my office who identified herself as a Republican, said that she liked me, just went on and on about what a great congressman I was, and I was, feeling real good about that, and that was wonderful. But then she pulled a piece of paper out of her pocket, and she said, "But I'm troubled by this, and I just got to ask you about it." She said, "I was out here with this education conference," and she said, "They passed out this scorecard, and Congressman DeWine, you had a 10 out of 100. She said, I just don't understand that. And they said, you're not for education, and you've got, that time, 6 children. She said, how could you not be for education? She went on and on and on. I said, well, let me look at the votes. I said, let me analyze the votes, and I'll get back to you, and I'll tell you why we voted on each one that way. She is not unusual. There's virtually everybody in this country has got some special group that reports to them, it seems like, and they have this scorecard. Well, when we got to analyzing the votes, what we found is that on most cases, there were votes where the bill itself, as on the House floor, increased funding for education, say 8 or 9%. There was an amendment offered to increase it to 15%, and I voted against it with a $200 billion deficit. That vote was labeled by that group as anti-education. Example after example after example. The other thing that you have is that on many of these scorecards, the environmentalist scorecards, labor scorecard, business scorecard, whoever's doing it, some of the votes have absolutely no connection to what you think they should be dealing with. Let me give you, I just pulled some specific examples that I would like to share with you. 1989, the National Education Association had, I believe that year, 10 key votes where they rated you whether or not you are pro-education, pro-kids, pro-children, or anti-children, anti-education. One of the votes on there was the minimum wage. Now, you can argue the minimum wage either way, but I'm not quite sure what that has to do with my kids' education, whether I'm pro-education or not. And we inquired, and the answer we got back was the minimum wage bill was the #1 priority of organized labor that year. And that's why it was on the National Education Association's list. Let me give you another one. 1989, the League of Conservation Voters, key environmental group, puts out ratings to determine whether you're an environmentalist. And I think most of us think we're an environmentalist. Let me tell you some of the key votes that year. One was on arms control. The vote was to force the president to negotiate with the Soviets. So a no vote saying, no, we're not going to force the president to negotiate with the Soviets on this specific issue, that was rated as an anti-environment vote by that environmental group. Let me give you another one that particularly galls me. I happen to be pro-life. I happen to be against abortion. 1989, same environmental group, one of their key votes that year as well was on UN population funding. And there were some of us who had a problem with that money because it was going to China to help China in their forced abortion policy. And so many of us on the House floor voted against that bill. This particular conservation group said that's an anti-environmental vote. It's that type scorecard mentality that drives members of Congress nuts. But that's not the problem. The real problem is members of Congress begin after a while, many of them, to look to those scorecards, look to those key votes, and cast the vote that will please that particular narrow interest group, irrespective of the common good for the general public, irrespective of what the facts are, merely because the label on the bill, or the label as it's been labeled by that particular special interest group, described it a certain way. That is a fundamental problem with our system. And it's a change that we have seen even since I have been in Congress, and I would bet if you went back 20 years, you would see a fundamental change. We've seen in this country a decline in the political parties, and at the same time, we've seen an increase in the special interest group, and I think that has caused some very serious problems with the United States Congress as well. I've just touched upon 2 or 3 main issues. What I would like to do tonight is to spend the time that we have with questions or comments. I think it's always kind of arrogant for a speaker to say, I want to take questions and I'll answer them. In the 15, 16 years I've been involved in politics, the thing that I've enjoyed most is interchange with people. And I've never come away from a meeting that I didn't learn something, that I didn't pick up something. And so I want to stop in just a moment and open it up for your questions. There are a lot of problems with Congress. We could talk about the continuing resolutions. Remember Ronald Reagan, President Reagan, when he addressed Congress at his last, I believe, State of the Union speech, and walked in with this big continuing resolution bill, which is sort of an omnibus bill where they throw everything in the kitchen sink in there, plopped it down and said, I'm not going to sign any more of these guys, no more. Well, that's part of the problem, where they pour everything into these bills. They introduce them late at night. This budget bill that we finally passed never hit the floor until midnight. And that was in a condensed form. And it was brought out. It was literally hauled out, and it was that big, and they plopped it down on the speaker's table. And we voted on it at 6 a.m. I mean, do you think anybody read it? Do you think anybody knew everything that was in it? Absolutely not. That's a problem. The Senate, and I focus mostly on the House, but the Senate almost ceases to function at times. They have no rules. and they just go on and on and on and on. And even in a democracy, sometimes you have to call it quits and say we're going to vote on something. So there are some monumental problems. I've just touched upon some of the problems, touched a few of the issues that I think are fundamental to why we have this problem in the United States Congress, but I would like at this point to open up and hear your comments or your questions. Who wants to start off? Everybody's satisfied with Congress. That's what it is. Well, I guess I would take a little, I don't disagree with what you said. What she basically said, for those of you, I have the mic, she doesn't, which is unfortunate, but basically, for those of you who couldn't hear, what she said was that I don't think it's fair for people to vote single interest in one issue. I have issues that I feel very strongly about, and so I guess I don't object to people doing that. What I object to is the mislabeling that takes place by some of these groups. And I also, I guess, really get upset when the issue is not an issue of principle, of fundamental principle, of moral principle, but when the issue is instead a pocketbook issue. You know, if you vote against me, if you vote against my group says you voted against me, then you don't like me. That type attitude. When in most cases what it really was, you know, everybody's in favor of cutting the budget deficit, so when Congress tries to do it, you have to do it on a specific bill, and so when I vote for a 10% increase in education as opposed to a 13% increase in education, and they label Mike DeWine's vote as anti-education, I think it's unfair. You know, I just think it's misleading as can be. Somebody else had it. Yes.
You mentioned political activities are preventing us from having good government.
I wouldn't go that far. I said one of the problems. I said if I was playing God and could reform, that's a reform I would make, and I've come to that rather reluctantly, and I've come to it after a long time of looking at the situation. Doesn't mean I'm right, but.
And would reform be abolishing political activities?
Well, I would abolish them, but I would do. You know, I think you also have to do other things. I think you have to make sure that some of the recent court decisions in regard to labor unions are followed as well, where people have the right to target where the money goes. I think there's been some problems there too. I just think overall, when you look at the fact that incumbents get 70%, 75% of PAC money, that it's a problem. I mean, that's reality. They're getting most of the money. It's perpetuated in the Congress, and I guess I look at it from someone who's been in the minority for 8 years, and who would like to see the Republican Party someday take control of the House, and if I want to see that happen, we got to beat incumbents.
Well, is there any serious reform legislation out there, and what could we as citizens do? And I guess the third question would be, what would your plan be?
Well, I have sponsored legislation when I was in Congress to abolish PACs. There are serious bills out there that would do that. I don't want to mislead anybody. I've just touched the tip of the iceberg. There are monumental problems with financing of elections. I mean, I think one of the things we ought to do, if we can do it constitutionally, is restrict out-of-state money that comes in. And let's let the people in the district raise the money. You know, Fran and I have a function in our house that some of you have attended. We've had it since 1976. And one of the reasons we have it is because it spreads out the base of people who financially support us. We had 5,000 people at our house last year for an ice cream social. It's $5 basically an adult. Kids come free. But you know, that's the type of thing. We need to spread out the base, and we need to get more people involved giving money. You know, I just get irritated as can be when I see a candidate in Ohio or Indiana spending all his time in Hollywood or in Florida. You know, I don't know if that's right. I don't know that some actor, I don't know if Jane Fonda ought to be helping to control who the next governor is of Ohio or who the next senator is of Ohio. You know, I think creates a problem. So I think we ought to, you know, cut some of the out-of-state money. I would do away with the PACs And I would try to deal with raising the money locally, more grassroots, a little more democracy. Yeah. Oh, I wouldn't venture to answer that one. I think you did have say some things we know. Without looking in anybody's heart, we can say some things we know. Because of transportation, we know that the early Congresses went to Congress, went to Washington, stayed a couple months, whatever it took to get the job done, and went home. I mean, we know that continued throughout most of the 19th century, actually well into the 20th century. I bet if you talk to members of Congress who were there in 1950, and there are a few of them left, you'd see a tremendous difference. You know, airplanes have changed it. Instead of dividing the year up, 3 months in Congress, 4 or 5, whatever it took to get the job done, we now divide the week up. Literally. Congress meets 3 days a week generally. Members then leave and go home and meet their constituents and then come back. Now, I did that. I made 50 trips a year. John Ashbrook used to do the same thing. He was back and forth. I'm not criticizing anybody for doing that. I'm just telling you that because of air conditioning and because of other technological changes, the way Congress meets has changed. And I think that has changed to some extent the idea of the citizen legislator. No one today, or very few people, can hold down another job and be a congressman. I don't know anybody that does that. But in the old days, farmers went, and businessmen went, and I suppose teachers, and you know, all people with all kinds of backgrounds. They left for 2 or 3 months. Someone else took care of their job, their business, but then they went home and did their business. It has changed now, and I think that is one of the reasons why the turnover rate has changed so much. Maybe there wasn't the vested interest in the job that there is today. No, you do not. Question is, am I in favor of term limitation? I haven't decided. I'm not trying to avoid the question. If I had to vote on today, I'd vote no. I find it to be, what I'd like to do is try to fix the system without such drastic surgery. I'd like to try some of these other things to make these seats competitive. And if that doesn't work, maybe then we have to go to term limitation. But I'll tell you, I think there is something fundamentally undemocratic about telling the voters of a congressional district that Ralph Regulo has served too long, or that Mike DeWine has served too long, that we're going to pass a law that says you as voters in a certain district, or Mike Oxley, or you pick the congressman, that you can't pick him anymore, or you can't pick her anymore. You know, I think the best antidote for the problem is more democracy, and we need to make these seats competitive. You know, I think it was a mistake in hindsight for the Republicans, and we pretty much did it after Franklin Roosevelt, to pass a term limitation for president. I find that to be undemocratic. I think what will happen, another thing that will happen, is that if you limit the terms of members of Congress, you will trade one problem for another problem. You will turn more power over to the bureaucrats, and you will turn more power over to the staff. If there's been an increase in the last 20 years in Congress, it's been in the staff. They're everywhere. I don't mean individual staff. I don't mean staff that does casework and does people's work from. I mean the committee staff. Unbelievable. When you show up at a committee, there are people there, you don't even know who they are, and you don't know what they do, but they're on staff. I mean, it's absolutely crazy. And what has happened is the committees or the members sit on the committee based upon a ratio of the Republicans and Democrats in the House. So, example, if the Republicans if there are 2 Democrats in the House for every 1 Republican, there's a 2-to-1 ratio on most committees. Rules Committee is an exception. They stack yet, but most of the other committees follow that. Staff doesn't follow that. There are some committees in the Congress that have 10 Democrat staff members for every 1 Republican staff member. And so, you know, let's don't turn the system over to the staff, because they're the ones who are going to be there all the time. They're going to have the institutional knowledge, and if you limit terms, the members aren't going to have that institutional knowledge, and you're going to lose, I think, you're going to lose some bad people as you want to get rid of, but I think you're going to be throwing out some good ones as well. I just think it's the wrong approach, but I may change my mind in a few years if we don't solve some of the problems. Who else? Let me off. Yeah, one.
Without the use of these scorecards, how is a concerned citizen supposed to know that you're representing them?
Well,
There's no way we can keep track of all the issues, bills, and amendments that you're facing.
well, I guess there's some truth in what you have to say, that without scorecards you can't keep track. There is some truth in that. I just find a lot of these scorecards to be very misleading, and I find them to be so narrowly focused that in some cases is the only thing that people are getting hit in the head with day after day, month after month, that scorecard. And I think it perverts the voting of Congress. I'm not sure I really have the answer other than more public scrutiny of the scorecards. I mean, I would like, for example, I'll give you the example, and for members of the media, the next time you run some conservation group that says Mike Oxley has a 50% voting record or Ralph Regula has a 50% voting record, run the votes too. Tell the people that one of the votes had to do with population control, which some of us don't think have a darn thing to do with the environment. That should not be my test of the environment. Or when the NEA says that it should be a minimum wage, or some of us don't think that has much to do with education. And yet when the media runs it, they get the faxed news release from the special interest group. They don't list the votes. I'd like the media to go back to that group and say, list the votes for us. And tell us what was a good vote and what a bad vote. I think if you did that, you'd have a better context for the whole thing. I'll take the last one over here.
Mr. Kirkland, who ran for governor one time along with the lady at the north end of the city, said one time that political contributions should be limited to those made by individuals rather than groups.
Well, I suppose to some extent that's what you do when you eliminate the political action committees. I mean, there's other ways of doing it, but basically that is what you were doing. I just think you need the more citizen involvement that you can, more people participating in the system, the better off you are. And I'm not in favor of public financing either. So. I've enjoyed being with you all. Thank you very much. Thanks, Dave.